There's a couple from a video I watched recently, married 58 years, still holding hands on camera, and about 4 minutes in, the husband looks straight into the lens and says, "Never stop trying to change each other. That's how you grow." And the comments. The comments were full of people typing relationship goals, and this is so beautiful. Nobody said a word about the fact that what he described is, clinically, one of the most reliable predictors of relationship breakdown. I want to introduce you to couples like Harold and Miriam, the kind you've seen in those videos. Married before most of your parents were born. People who weathered things that would end relationships today, job losses, grief, years when they probably didn't like each other very much. There is something real and hard-won in that kind of longevity. They deserve to be heard. And they are going to be heard in this video. But here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. Longevity is not the same as wisdom, and wisdom is not the same as transferable wisdom. 60 years of marriage is evidence of endurance. It is not, on its own, a peer-reviewed study. The couples we tend to celebrate most, the ones who make it to 50, 60 years together, were, in many cases, shaped by a world that made leaving nearly impossible. Divorce was a social death sentence, particularly for women. Financial independence for wives was the exception, not the norm. Mental health care was either inaccessible or considered shameful. Couples therapy, as a formal discipline, barely existed in any recognizable form until the 1980s. None of that means their marriages were frauds. None of that means their advice is worthless. But it does mean that some of what they call wisdom is actually survival strategy, and survival strategies born inside a trap don't always translate to people who have the freedom to leave, to speak, to choose differently. This video is about 3 specific things we have inherited from that generation as marriage truths, things that get repeated in every relationship advice corner of the internet, quoted on throw pillows, tattooed on forearms, that modern psychology has either seriously complicated or outright contradicted. We are not here to mock anyone. We are here to do what good translators do, honor the original text and tell you what gets lost in a bad translation. By the time we're done, you're going to have 3 updated principles, not replacements for what the elders taught, but renovations. Walls kept, load-bearing or not determined, outdated wiring replaced. The house is still theirs. The house just has to be livable in 2026. The first myth is the one that sounds the most obviously true, which is exactly why it's the most dangerous one to leave unexamined. You have heard this one so many times it probably doesn't even register as advice anymore. It registers as fact. It's in wedding speeches. It's cross-stitched onto guest bedroom pillows. And if you grew up watching any elderly couple be interviewed about the secret to their marriage, there is a roughly 70% chance this was their answer. The version Harold and Miriam, and couples like them, usually tell goes something like this: we made a rule on our wedding night. Whatever happened during the day, we resolved it before we turned off the light. We never let the sun set on our anger. 58 years, and we never broke that rule. And the room sighs. And the comments fill up. And nobody asks the obvious question: what exactly were you doing in those late-night arguments? Were you resolving conflict, or were you just exhausting each other into agreement? Here's the context layer. Harold and Miriam formed this rule in an era when emotional conflict between spouses was supposed to be invisible by morning, because the morning meant work and children, and a social world that did not make space for a couple to be visibly struggling. There was enormous cultural pressure to appear resolved, regardless of whether resolution had actually occurred. Never go to bed angry may have functioned, for many couples, as a norm about performance, not emotional health. The research tells a more complicated story. Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard have documented extensively that a wandering, unresolved mind is an unhappy mind, but the solution to that isn't forced resolution at midnight. Physiologically, when we are in active conflict, our heart rate elevates, our cortisol spikes, and our prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for empathy and rational problem solving, becomes significantly less effective. John Gottman's lab work found that flooding, the state of physiological overwhelm during conflict, makes productive conversation nearly impossible. His recommendation? A structured break of at least 20 minutes before attempting repair. Sometimes going to bed angry is not a failure. Sometimes it is the most loving thing you can do for the argument you're trying to have. The updated principle: don't resolve the conflict before bed. Regulate yourselves before bed. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. The second myth feels gentler than the first. It's framed as a positive, which makes it harder to argue with, and more worth arguing with. Every elder couple has a version of this story. The moment they knew. The first time they saw each other across a diner, a church, a factory floor. The certainty. The way Miriam always says, I just knew he was different. I knew he was the one. And Harold nods. And it's beautiful. It is beautiful. I don't want to take that from them. But here's what this framing quietly does to modern couples. It shifts the entire weight of relationship success onto a single moment of selection, as though love is primarily a matter of finding, not building. It positions the health of your relationship as something that was largely determined before you even said hello, by compatibility, by fate, by chemistry, rather than something that is actively constructed, maintained, and repeatedly chosen. This belief was shaped by the world Harold and Miriam lived in, where partner selection was geographically constrained, socially curated, and relatively swift. You married someone from your town, your church, your social class, your race, often within a few years of meeting. The cultural narrative of the right person served as a meaning-making frame for a decision that had very little data behind it. It made the leap feel sacred rather than statistically uncertain. Modern attachment research, particularly the work of Sue Johnson, the founder of emotionally focused therapy, reframes the question entirely. Johnson's decades of clinical work suggest that what determines long-term relationship health is not the initial compatibility of two people but the security of the emotional bond they build over time. Specifically, whether each partner believes the other will be there when they reach out. Whether the attachment system feels safe. That's not destiny. That's daily practice. The right person framing also carries a quiet danger. If things get hard, it provides a devastating exit ramp. Maybe I chose wrong. Maybe they're not the one. Every rough patch becomes evidence of a bad selection rather than an invitation to repair. The updated principle: you don't find the right person. You become the right partner, again and again, and every season the relationship moves through. This one is delivered with such tenderness by elder couples that pushing back on it feels almost cruel. Harold will reach over, take Miriam's hand, and say something like, "The secret is simple. You stop thinking about yourself. Every morning I wake up and my first thought is, what does she need today?" 60 years of putting her first. That's the whole answer. The audience melts. Understandably. And there is something genuinely beautiful in what Harold is describing, a orientation toward generosity, toward attentiveness, toward your partner's experience. That impulse is not wrong. But the ideology built around it, always put your spouse first, always, as a rule, as a virtue, as the measure of your love, is one of the more quietly damaging things we have inherited from mid-century marriage culture. Here's the context layer, and I want to be direct about it. Put your spouse first was not a mutual norm for most of the marriages that produced this advice. It was, in the vast majority of cases, a norm that applied asymmetrically, and you already know which direction. Wives were expected to subordinate their needs, their ambitions, their identities, as a matter of social and legal reality. When Harold says he put Miriam first, I believe him. I also know that Miriam's version of putting Harold first carried a weight his never did, because the world was not set up to support her selfhood in the same way it supported his. When this advice is stripped of that context and handed to modern couples as a gender-neutral principle, it tends to replicate the same asymmetry, because couples don't exist in a vacuum. They exist inside a culture that still, in 2026, distributes domestic labor, emotional labor, and career sacrifice unevenly along gender lines. The research here is pointed. Studies on what psychologists call self-expansion theory, developed by Arthur and Elaine Aron, suggest that the healthiest long-term relationships are not ones where individuals disappear into each other, but ones where each partner actively supports the other's growth as a separate self. Enmeshment, the state where two people's identities become indistinguishable, is not romantic fusion. Clinically, it's a risk factor. For anxiety, for resentment, for the particular kind of crisis that happens when the children leave or one partner retires and two people suddenly realize they have no idea who they are without the role they played for each other. What Harold got right: generosity. Attentiveness. Waking up and thinking about someone other than yourself. What the framing gets wrong: the self you're setting aside still exists. It will find a way to make itself known, through resentment, through depression, through the quiet flatness that settles into a marriage where one or both people have been slowly disappearing for decades. The updated principle: don't put your partner first. Put the relationship first, and that means both of you have to remain whole enough to actually be in it. And here I want to name something directly, because this channel doesn't earn your trust by looking away from uncomfortable things. Harold and Miriam built their marriage on one income, one career, a social infrastructure, church, neighborhood, extended family that provided community, childcare support, and belonging largely for free. Their advice on unity, on putting the marriage at the center of everything, on prioritizing the partnership over individual ambition, it is advice that was enabled by a specific economic and social architecture that fewer and fewer couples have access to. Fewer than a third of American households today can sustain themselves on one income. Most couples are navigating two careers, two sets of professional ambitions, and the near-total absence of the village that once made marriage sustainable. When we hand modern dual-income couples the advice of a single-income era without naming that gap, we're not honoring Harold and Miriam's wisdom. We're setting people up to feel like they're failing at something they were never actually set up to do. The wisdom is real. The conditions that made it easy to practice are largely gone. Both things are true. Miriam says it with a kind of wistful certainty: after a while, you just know. He'd walk through the door and I could tell exactly what kind of day he'd had. I didn't need to ask. I just knew. This is the myth of the mind-reading marriage. And it is, in the vocabulary of modern relationship therapy, one of the most seductive and destructive ideals we carry. The context layer, emotional attunement without explicit communication was, for many couples of that era, a necessary adaptation. Direct conversation about emotional needs, especially for men, was socially prohibited. Vulnerability was coded as weakness. Asking for what you needed was coded as burden. So couples developed elaborate systems of inference, intuition, and behavioral reading because the direct path was culturally unavailable to them. What Harold and Miriam experienced as romantic knowing was, in part, a workaround for a world that didn't permit honest emotional expression. The research on this is stark. Mind-reading expectations, what therapists sometimes call the mind-reading myth, are consistently associated with lower relationship satisfaction and higher conflict. Esther Perel, the Belgian psychotherapist whose work on modern desire and intimacy has reached millions, frames it this way: we have shifted enormous responsibility onto our romantic partners to intuit, divine, and fulfill needs that an entire village once shared. And then we call it love when they succeed, and betrayal when they fail. The expectation that love means never having to explain yourself is not romantic. It is a setup. Because your partner is not a mind reader. They are a person, with their own history, their own emotional filters, their own bad days, doing their best to see you through all of that. What Harold and Miriam built over 58 years was a database, a deep archive of each other's patterns, preferences, and tells. That is genuinely beautiful. But it is not a substitute for language. It is a supplement to it. The updated principle: stop waiting to be understood. Start practicing being known, which means saying the thing, even when you're sure they should already know it. This is the one elder couples usually save for last. The one delivered most quietly, with the most weight behind it. Harold will look at his hands, or out a window, and say something like, "There were years, hard years, where I didn't know if we were going to make it. And I just decided. I decided we were going to be okay. I made that choice and I didn't look back." Every time I hear a version of this, I feel two things simultaneously. The first is genuine awe. Because there is something in that kind of committed, almost stubborn resolve that modern culture has genuinely lost something by abandoning. We live in an era of optionality, where the presence of alternatives is constant and the psychological pull of the exit is always there, humming quietly in the background. Harold's willingness to decide and mean it is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite rare. The second thing I feel is worry. Because I decided and I didn't look back is not one story. It is at least two. In one version, it is the story of a person who chose love over fear during a temporary hardship, and that choice became the foundation of something lasting. In the other version, and this version exists, and it matters, it is the story of a person who confused commitment with endurance, who stayed through something they shouldn't have stayed through, and who built a life around not looking back because looking back would have asked too much of them. The context layer: Harold's generation did not have the language for what they were navigating. They did not have a therapist's office to walk into and say, "I think I married someone whose emotional unavailability is reactivating my childhood wounds." They did not have a framework for distinguishing between a relationship that was hard because relationships are hard, and a relationship that was hard because something was fundamentally broken. They had will. They had stubbornness. They had the social pressure of a world that did not offer easy exits. And they called all of it commitment, because they didn't have another word. The psychological framework that speaks most directly to this is the distinction, developed across several decades of relationship science, between what researchers call dedication commitment and constraint commitment. Dedication is the internal pull toward a partner, the genuine desire to be with them, to invest in them, to build something with them. Constraint is everything that makes leaving difficult: finances, children, social expectations, fear, habit. Both can keep a marriage intact. Only one of them keeps a marriage alive. Harold and Miriam's 60 years may have been full of dedication. I hope it was. But the advice "just decide and don't look back" does not teach you how to cultivate dedication. It teaches you how to stay, which is not the same thing, and which, for some people in some marriages, is actively the wrong lesson. The updated principle: commitment isn't the decision you make on your wedding day. It's the decision you remake, with full information, full presence, and full honesty, every time the relationship asks something hard of you. Here's what I notice when I look at all 5 of these myths together. And this is the thing I haven't seen anyone else name directly. Every single one of them is a myth about ease. Never go to bed angry, so the conflict doesn't have to sit with you. Find the right person, so the work of becoming is optional. Put your spouse first, so the difficult negotiation of 2 full selves never has to happen. They'll know what you need, so the terrifying vulnerability of asking is never required. Decide once, so the ongoing, active, effortful nature of love is compressed into a single moment of will. What Harold and Miriam's generation understood, viscerally, practically, is that marriage is hard. What they did not always have the language or the freedom to understand is which kind of hard it's supposed to be. There is the heart of 2 people doing the difficult, rewarding work of truly knowing each other and growing alongside each other. And there is the heart of 2 people white-knuckling through something that is diminishing them both. The myths we've inherited tend to make both kinds of hard feel like the same thing, like evidence of commitment, like proof of love, like the price you pay and the price you're supposed to pay without complaint. The generation that survived the Depression and 2 world wars had an extraordinary tolerance for suffering as a neutral fact of life. We inherited their endurance and called it relationship wisdom. But endurance was never the point. It was the means. The point, the thing they were enduring toward, was a life shared with someone who saw them, who chose them, who made the ordinary bearable and the unbearable survivable. Call it the endurance confusion. We took the vehicle and forgot the destination. Modern couples are navigating something Harold and Miriam never had to, the constant, low-grade anxiety of infinite choice. The social media version of every relationship you're not in. The algorithmic suggestion that somewhere, in someone else's living room, a more compatible person is waiting. The paradox of having more freedom than any generation before you and feeling more uncertain about your choices because of it. Harold didn't scroll past 500 other potential Miriams before committing. That's not nothing. That's a fundamentally different psychological starting point. What you need is not the myth of the easy marriage. You need something harder and more honest, a practice. A daily, renewable, occasionally inconvenient practice of choosing the person in front of you, not because the choice was made once and sealed, but because you keep finding, when you look clearly, that they are worth choosing again. I want to come back to Harold and Miriam one more time. Not to their advice. To them. 60 years is a long time to choose the same person. 60 years is a long time to watch someone age, to absorb their moods, to navigate their silences, to be known in all the ways that intimacy makes you known, including the unflattering ways, the embarrassing ways, the ways you'd never show a stranger. There is a particular kind of courage in that. Not the dramatic courage of a single decision, but the quiet, unglamorous courage of 10,000 ordinary mornings where you looked at this person and stayed. What it costs us to pretend their world and ours are identical is that we stop learning from them. We take their conclusions without understanding their reasoning, their outcomes without understanding their conditions, and then we wonder why the advice doesn't fit. What it costs us to throw their wisdom away entirely is something different, and maybe worse. It's the arrogance of believing that the only knowledge worth having is recent knowledge. That longevity teaches us nothing. That a person who has loved someone for 6 decades has nothing to offer someone who has loved someone for 6 months. Both mistakes leave us poorer. The translation is the work. The translation is always the work. If you watched this video and felt a quiet recognition in one of these myths, if you heard "never go to bed angry" and realized you have been forcing resolution that was actually just exhaustion, or if you heard "find the right person" and recognized the exit ramp it gave you the last time things got hard, sit with that. Not with shame. Shame closes things down. Sit with it with curiosity instead, the way you'd sit with a room in your house you've been avoiding, not because it's dangerous, but because you knew that going in there would ask something of you. You already knew some of this. That's usually how it works with things that matter. So here's what I want you to carry out of this, in plain language, one myth at a time. Don't resolve the conflict before bed, regulate yourselves before bed, and trust that a rested mind will find what an exhausted one couldn't. Stop waiting to find the right person and start asking whether you are practicing being the right partner, today, in this relationship, with this specific human being. Keep yourself whole inside your commitment, because a marriage built on 2 people who have quietly disappeared is not intimacy, it's a very long, very polite haunting. Say the thing out loud, even when you're certain they should already know it. Being known is not a passive experience, it requires your participation. And recommit, not once, not on your anniversary, not only when things are good, but in the ordinary moments when love asks you to choose it without any guarantee of how the story ends. I'm genuinely curious which of these 5 landed hardest for you, and why. Not which one you agreed with most. Which one cost you something to hear. That's usually the more interesting answer, and I'd love to read it in the comments. And if you grew up watching a grandparent or older relative love someone for a very long time, if you have a piece of their wisdom that you've been carrying, whether it fits or not, share it. That's what this channel is for. Not to archive the past. Not to discard it. To figure out, together, what we actually want to keep. If that's the kind of conversation you want to keep having, there's a subscribe button here somewhere, and I would genuinely love for you to use it. The elders didn't give us a map, they gave us a record of one path through difficult terrain, and the least we can do is read it honestly before we decide which parts of it to follow.